So if you look back just a couple of years, 8, 9, 10 years, the state had, revenue surpluses, and we were putting a lot of that money away into savings accounts and building up a budget reserve in the constitutional budget reserve and statutory budget reserve of just over $16 billion at its peak in fiscal year 13. But as we all know in this group, that didn't last. Oil price and production crashed, resulting in pretty significant deficits. You can see there on the difference between the gold and the red lines on this chart. And really, we've been drawing down on those savings over time. That large savings balance of $16 billion in fiscal year 13 is really what allowed us to weather this storm for as long as we had. At this point, though, it really is, it's no longer necessarily a storm. This is just the new normal. These kind of lower oil revenue prices are really kind of where we're at. It's what we have to plan around. It's not a temporary thing that we can just sort of, work our way through and hope it goes away. So you can see in these gold lines in fiscal year 19, the dotted gold line, which represents traditional revenue plus draws from the earnings reserve. In fiscal year 19, you can see that come up and get pretty close to total spending in the dotted red line. And that's the implementation of the percent of market value draw on the earnings reserve, which allows for a sustainable draw on the earnings reserve that ensures that the fund maintains value over time and really ensures that we don't, have a result that looks similar to this graph in the earnings reserve, that we maintain that balance and can maintain that stability in revenue. So it added a layer of stable revenue on top of the more volatile traditional revenue sources that we have. But looking at this blue bar, which represents the CBR and the SBR, of course, the SBR now is completely empty. The last of that value was appropriated out. But the value the balance in the CBR now is seen right around $1 billion. And for state purposes, $1 billion does sound like, oh, that can cover maybe another year's deficit. But really, for purposes of the state, we need that cash on hand for just day-to-day operations. There's no necessarily magic number of CBR balance, but the state does need roughly $500 million or so to accommodate things like spending in advance of federal revenue collections. For a lot of the bigger federal programs in the state, state highway spending and the Medicaid program, we spend that money out of the state treasury in advance of the federal government reimbursing us. So we need a pot of money on hand that we can go to for just cash flow needs. So really, we see this balance, while there's not really a magic number to it, keeping a stable balance around $1 billion is prudent. And so you can see that's what we've got going into 22 based on our proposal. And really, that's the thinking there, to try to keep that balance somewhat stable so that we don't have to turn to other mechanisms for cash management that may not be necessarily as advantageous for the state. So looking back at just kind of more recent history of what we've done in terms of state budget. So this, you can see the fiscal year 19 authorized budget as compared to 20 and then 21, which is the fiscal year we're currently living in. On the revenue side, you can see a drop in 20, and primarily that's due to a pretty significant drop in traditional revenue. In fiscal year 20, as we all know, coronavirus happened and really impacted global demand for oil, and we saw a pretty significant drop in those traditional revenues as a result. You can also see that reduction continuing into 21. On the spending side, agency operations, you can see a small uptick in fiscal year 2020 from fiscal year 2019. Really, a lot of that has to do with $110 million that needed to be spent on fire suppression. We had a fairly large fire year. If you controlled for that spending, you would actually see a little bit of a decline in agency operations spending. And then you can see that agency operations spending coming back down in that FY22 management plan column. On the statewide operations side, and statewide operations, when we talk about that in the state budget world, we're really talking about debt service, fund capitalizations, and retirement payments, retirement assistance payments that we make on behalf of other members of the PERS system. You can see that statewide operations cost coming down, and primarily what's going on there is a reduction in school bond debt reimbursement into 2020. It was funded at a 50% level, and in 2021 it was not funded at all. On the capital side, just a little bit more variability there. You can see a small uptick in 2020. This is really just representing sort of that bare minimum capital budget, matching federal funds, matching highway match, village safe water, and a handful of other capital investments. In 2021, that significant decline isn't necessarily a significant decline in the amount of capital need that's there. Really, that represents legislative session adjourning fairly early this last year with capital budget that wasn't fully completed. Coronavirus coming in and interrupting that state budgeting process, resulted in some capital projects sort of having to, I guess, sit and wait until we are able to address them again through the next legislative session. And you'll see in some of our budget proposals where we've gone in and brought those projects back for consideration as part of a fast-track supplemental budget. At the bottom line, you can see the deficits, and these are really those draws bringing us down to that $1 billion level in the CBR shown on the prior slide. So looking forward for revenue, and I'm not going to steal too much of Department of Revenue's thunder. I know they're coming up in a couple of weeks, and I'm definitely not the one to speak in detail to revenue projections. But just looking out on the revenue sources book that they've released, you can see traditional UGF revenue, they're projecting going up slightly over time. And so that's good news. It's not a massive rebound, but it is a little bit of sunshine at the end of the horizon. On the POMV ERA draw, what we're showing here isn't directly from the revenue sources book. This is showing the POMV ERA draw projections based on the proposals that we've put forward for the FY21 and 22 dividend draws. And so it does show that impact of the POMV draw over time. Just kind of some key figures on here. The oil price to balance FY22 budget would be $49. The price to balance the budget without an ERA draw for the PFD would be $102. So what are we doing to address the spending side of this equation? What efforts have we been doing over the last year? A year ago, I sat in front of a lot of you in various forums and talked about the cost drivers behind the state and what we needed to do to address them. So I'm kind of here to tell you today that, well, we weren't able to address many of them. On the Medicaid side, the people, the staff, the individuals who would be working on Medicaid reform and looking at how do we address the cost drivers of Medicaid, really they were redeployed to working on coronavirus response. Coronavirus coming in really deflected what we were doing at the state. It really changed our priorities and what we were able to actually accomplish in some of these areas. So those same staff, instead of working on the big policy issues surrounding Medicaid, we're working on the big policy issues surrounding responding to a massive pandemic. On the K-12 side, very similar. Instead of trying to look at what is the function of K-12 funding, how do we best fund an adequate education in the state, they were looking at how do we assist school districts in transitioning to a completely new model of education delivery and working through the other issues that are happening with coronavirus, kids not being in classrooms or getting kids into classrooms in a safe manner. So really that was another area where we wanted to look at how do we address cost drivers, but really weren't able to. State retirement assistance is another large cost driver in the state that's been ticking up over time, and we actually do have a proposal to address some of those costs that I'll talk about a little bit later. And then state payroll. about 17,000 PCNs. It's about 19% of the state's budget. And looking at that, we have looked at a couple of areas. They're smaller items, but they do add up. A couple areas to eliminate some of those funded but vacant positions and find ways of doing things a little more efficiently, which again I'll address when I'm talking about a couple of the high points in our budget proposal in a couple of slides. So top level of what we've put together over the last several months, change from 21 to 22. If you take a look at this, there's an increase in UGF revenue primarily. That is because in FY21, we used a portion of that POMV draw to pay for permit fund dividends. In FY22, you don't see that reflected. So that increase in revenue really is just a reflection of using the entire POMV draw for government operations. On the spending side, you can see a $295 million reduction in spending level. A lot of that is the expiration of $90 million in UGF coronavirus response funding in the Department of Health and Social Services. There's an appropriation that was effective for 2 years. That appropriation is expiring, and so that is reflected in those numbers as 90 million reduction. The other large piece of that reduction that is in the capital budget, you can see a drop from 120 million to 58.5. Really what that's reflecting is the way that we're financing the capital budget this year. So in order to take advantage of the historically low interest rates that we see in the bond market and to save some state money in FY22 when we're looking at a fairly significant deficit, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation came to us with a concept of using their bonding authority in order to cover match on the transportation projects as well as the Village Safe Water project. So, two areas with the biggest federal match in the state capital budget. That is a concept that hasn't been used in quite a few years, but has been done a couple of times in the past. And the payment for that debt comes out of, or is guaranteed by the corporation, and comes out of the dividend that they pay back to the state. So it's, it's not free, but we have very low interest rates. It's, it's a good time to use tools like that. So at the bottom line, it's still a deficit of about $40 million. And so that would be coming out of the constitutional budget reserve. So looking at where that's coming from, looking at those state savings balances, you can see on the right-hand side of this screen is our estimates for the constitutional budget reserve. These balance estimates are based on the last audited CAFR, so that would be the CAFR for fiscal year 19. And so walking those forward based on deposits into the funds and our anticipated withdrawals is how we get to our roughly $1 billion balance. You can see that deficit draw in fiscal year 22 is roughly equal to the projected earnings and deposits. So they sort of wash each other out. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see our projections on the permit fund earnings reserve balance. Again, this is just based on the most recent public information that we had and then walking it forward. So you can see there the draws both for government as well as the additional draws to pay for the statutory PFD obligation. So a couple of high-level items of note within the state's operating and capital budgets. I mentioned earlier some efficiencies found related to state workforce in the Division of Public Assistance. Really, I guess actually to take a step back, when we went out and talked to commissioners and talked to departments about putting together the budget, a couple of the key priorities that we talked to them about was, we're in a situation where we've been sort of forced to experiment with telework. It's not necessarily something that every department would have, jumped into feet first this year, but we were kind of forced to. And so we asked them to say, hey, take a look at this experiment. It might be a little too early to figure out where we can make that permanent or if it's a lasting thing, but take a look at how it's impacted your workflows, and are there things that you've noticed in your workflow, that you've noticed in your operations, that you can make some lasting tweaks, you can find some efficiencies there. And so one of the areas that really should be highlighted is the Division of Public Assistance. A big thing that they ran into when they sent everybody to work from home was, how do you deal with a paper-heavy work process? They're receiving applications in paper and having to process them. So they implemented a new just paper processing system. It's a tool that scans and catalogs information on a piece of paper, and it connects into their database. And it has saved a massive number of work hours. They're also a division that sees a lot of turnover year to year, some years as much as 25% turnover. And so as a result, they're able to use that turnover to remove positions via attrition. So they're able to achieve this nearly $5 million UGF reduction in 122 positions without any layoffs, just simply through attrition and through just efficiencies that they were able to achieve by responding to a separate problem. So we've also seen a lot of other areas in the budget where same sort of idea has played out, but at a much smaller scale, not necessarily $5 million. That's a big chunk of efficiency to find. But you can see that the third bullet down is kind of an aggregate of some of the smaller areas where people have found, hey, we really don't need to travel. We can use Zoom for meetings. People are getting a little more comfortable with that because they've sort of been forced to. And so we can find some savings there, savings on some of the things we otherwise would buy when people were in the office. And then looking at just PCNs that have been vacant for a long period of time, for a year or more, that are still funded, and kind of cleaning those up out of the budget system. Moving up a bullet to the Alaska PERS cost share. So the state of Alaska currently, the way that we fund the PERS system is we've capped the rate of payroll, or the rate that's paid on top of payroll into the PERS system, at 22%. However, the actuarial liability of the PERS system is closer to 30%. So that difference between the 22% cap and the actuarial rate, the state pays in as the state assistance program. And it's a roughly $350 million item in the state's budget. So that additional cost is paid solely through UGF revenues. However, some of those state employees that pay into PERS, that are part of the PERS system, or well, all state employees that are part of the PERS system, some of them have their salaries covered partially by the federal government. They work on federal programs, their salaries are partially billable back to the federal government. And so that difference between the 22% of payroll and the actuarial rate is an amount that we haven't been charging the federal government for in the past, but is the true cost of that employee. So we've introduced a statutory change that would raise that 22%, but only for the state of Alaska as an employer. So that's the important piece, is that this is only impacting the state of Alaska as an employer and not any of the other PERS plan participants. And the reason for that is that will then allow us to charge that full actuarial rate of those employees back to other payers. So that includes both the federal side and also other payers that are non-federal payers. Some of those other areas where positions are supported through program receipts or through other funds. And so in aggregate, all of those small changes in the way we charge for those employees add up to about a $43 million UGF savings, because we're taking about $100 million UGF cost out of the state assistance program, placing it into agency budgets where they're then able to bill that out to other payers, and we save about $43 million. Another high-level item of note is the Alaska Marine Highway System. So there's a reshaping study that was done over the course of the summer, and were released over the course of the summer. And so we put forward a budget proposal that's just flat from what was proposed last year. That represents a reduction from the amount that was added through the legislative process last year. The purpose of that, and the purpose of putting in just a flat budget, is because that reshaping study, really, there's a lot more stakeholders to it than just the executive branch. And so we want to be able to have that discussion of what the marine highway system looks like, and more out in the open and with legislative stakeholders and with other stakeholders, rather than kind of coming in with a sort of line in the sand decision on what that system should look like. We've also used some short-term financing type savings that are not necessarily things that are lasting, but are things that can save us money in the short term while we have such a significant issue with the deficit. So a lot of it comes from the use of CARES Act funding. There's a couple of areas where, outside of that, the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, that I think is a piece that gets the most news, but there's some other pockets of money that the CARES Act allocated directly to specific purposes. For example, in the Medicaid program, our SNAP, the federal participation into Medicaid, was increased by 6.2%. That saves us about $14 to $15 million per quarter. And then in DOT, they received a significant amount of money that can pay for aviation runway maintenance. And they're able to utilize the general fund dollars that used to pay for runway maintenance to pay for other maintenance activities. And it saves some UGF within the DOT maintenance budget. In Medicaid, we're utilizing those savings from the enhanced FMAP to carry forward savings from 21 into fiscal year 22 so that we can show some savings on UGF in 22. The idea there is that we know that Medicaid changes and adjustments take a lot of time and a lot of effort. There's a lot of interaction with CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, at the federal level. There's a lot of interaction that has to happen there, and Medicaid savings can't really just be flipped on quickly. So utilizing some of our saved money this year gives them a bit of a runway in order to have time to implement savings as they work through fiscal year 22. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation bonding, that's a one-time thing that we can use to cover some of that those match dollars in the capital budget this year. Another item of note is the education system. The K-12 formula was fully funded at the base student allocation. However, that formula, as a result of some of those demographic changes that we've seen this past year of how students receive education, that formula results in actually an overall reduction to education funding. So it's a fully funded formula that results in a budget reduction. You can see on this chart here that pretty significant shift from regular in-classroom education to correspondence. A reduction of 6,600 roughly regular in-classroom students to an increase of 4,600 correspondence students, for a net of a reduction of about 2,000 in the ADM, which is the average daily membership. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is roughly a $20 million reduction in just the K-12 formula piece. Additionally, and not represented on this slide, the student transportation piece of the K-12 formula similarly reduced based on that reduction in student count. Additionally, we funded the school bond debt reimbursement program, again at 50%, which is the same as it was funded in fiscal year 20. One thing you'll see here, because the school fund has a pretty significant balance in it, we were able to fund at 50% with only roughly 17 or 12 to $15 million UGF capitalization of school bond debt reimbursement. Also, the REA school construction fund or school maintenance fund is funded at 50%. The Community Assistance Fund was capitalized per the statutory formula. That formula is based off of earnings from the Power Cost Equalization Fund. Earnings in that fund weren't enough to give the sort of traditional $30 million deposit into this fund. and they earned enough to fund about $12.4 million deposit. Oil and gas tax credits have been funded at the statutory minimum, which is $60 million. So the oil and gas tax credits, as some of you are probably aware, there was a plan to utilize bonding to pay down all of the tax credits. However, that plan was determined by the courts not to be not allowable. So we're now back to funding at that statutory minimum. And we also have a fairly standard capital budget that's focused on just those areas where we're matching to federal revenues or the sort of normal annual recurring capital projects. So kind of changing gears a little bit. So this slide is a slide showing the change in personal income in the state of Alaska. And so what we're trying to illustrate here is sort of explain what's happened in the economy, what's happened to individuals in the economy over this past year. COVID has had a very significant impact nationally, but also very much in Alaska's economy. We're very reliant on tourism over the summer, and we're reliant on oil production during the entire year. In 2019, a fairly normal looking year, you can see the change in personal income from the first quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2019 is what's represented at the top. So you have transfer income, small increase of 155 million. Capital income, which is, investment earnings, rent, interest, is increase of 64 million. And labor income, your wages and salaries, at 73 million. And down below, you can see that stark contrast to what happened in 2020. From quarter one to quarter two of 2020, wages and salaries in Alaska were down $2.2 billion. Investment earnings, rents, and interest were down $139 million. But transfer income, government assistance programs were up $4.9 billion. The thing, that looks like that transfer income offsets the labor income. But the thing to consider when you actually look at this trend, you think about the impacts here, is that transfer income represents those additional UI payments and the $1,200 tax credits. Those were things that really happened in quarter two and didn't continue into quarter three. We're not at the same level as they happened in quarter two. And so that green bar, that massive increase in the green bar, once quarter three data is available, you'll see that green bar shrink and disappear, but that blue bar will stay negative. We know that labor income is still down. We still have a record number of people, receiving unemployment, filing for unemployment. And the other high-level thing here on the slide, we lost $5.6 billion in Alaska's GDP over this time period, even with $5.8 billion coming in federal stimulus. So that loss in GDP is accounting for that increase in federal spending into the state. So it's very significant. We are in a worse position than on the national scale on average. We've been impacted pretty significantly. So what can we do about that? That picture is why we've chosen to introduce an economic stability plan. Part of that is the standard capital budget I talked about. That's construction jobs, that's village safe waters, jobs out into communities. But also we're introducing a $350 million general obligation bond. So what we're looking for there are projects that will get people to work, and also projects that will give some stability into the future, some knowledge that there are projects in the pipe coming forward that will allow people to plan ahead and plan for projects and give a little bit of stability to some of those industries that we can give stability to, and then hopefully those jobs created go and spend money in the communities and help out some of those hospitality industries that were pretty heavily hit by the coronavirus pandemic. So that bond package, it'll be introduced sometime before session. We don't have that specific list yet, just the idea of what types of projects that we're looking for. In addition, as part of that stabilization package are those permanent fund dividend payments, the statutory dividend in fiscal year 22, and completion of statutory dividend for fiscal year 21. In total, all those things together, including some of the federal funds coming in to match those capital projects, is about a $5 billion total investment in Alaska's economy. So looking out into the future, based on the budget that we've proposed and the various constitutional amendments that we've proposed, this is kind of our 5-year outlook. So one of the biggest things that I haven't touched on yet that you can see down at the bottom of this is the proposal of a change to the permanent fund dividend statute. So we all know that statute has been sort of one of the most difficult discussion points over the last several years. And so actually going in and changing the statute is something that might last longer and be more durable is fairly important. Being able to kind of finish that conversation so that we can move on to other important conversations around Alaska's fiscal picture. But you can see that even with implementing that change in this model going forward, there's still a fairly significant deficit in fiscal year 23 through 26. And so there isn't a solution that solves the entire problem right now. We need to work through kind of each step of the problem and be thinking about that big picture at the end of the day and how do we solve some of these larger issues. It's really, in conclusion, this is how we've gone to where we are, but we need to start to find ways to sort of stem those losses in our savings accounts. Things like fixing the permanent fund dividend statute and solving that question, constitutional amendment to limit draws from the ERA so that that fund stays there into the future, and taking the time to actually address some of those larger cost drivers in the state are very important for Alaska's fiscal future. And so with that, I'll take any questions that have come in through the chat, and I'm happy to answer anything.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Neil. The good news is we have a very knowledgeable audience, and so they'll probably put you through your paces this morning. We have some sort of underlying questions to just clarify some earlier points, and I'm actually glad you landed on this slide again. With regard to the historical savings balances, how are those reflected? How does it reflect the amounts that come from the CBR and the SBR? So specifically, is it really recognizing that revenue from the CBR essentially as UGF?
So the draws on historical savings and how those get reflected in kind of our charts and tables? Is that the question?
In the historical savings balances.
No, Juanetta.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize. I thought I was on mute. Sorry about that. She says out loud. Okay, so looking at the very first slide, Neil. Go back. It may be on this one too that you're on, but where you look at spending over time, yeah, this one. So included in your traditional UGF revenue, do you include the amount spent from the CBR?
No, we don't. So the amount, we're just including, traditional earned revenue, not draws from savings. And so that's also why we show the dotted yellow line there as well, is to show, adding in the POMV draw and kind of showing it separate from that traditional oil and tax revenue, that structured draw from savings. But we don't include in these revenue numbers a draw from the CBR or draw from the SBR or additional draw from the ERA because those are not, necessarily structured, statutory revenue comes in.
So then
so just that you can kind of imply that CBR, SBR draw based on the gap between the yellow and red line.
Huh.
Okay.
Because if we included CBR, SBR draw in the revenue numbers, the lines would just flow with each other and be the same.
Well, but it would also show how you're paying for state services, because by leaving them out, you don't show you're understating the revenue amounts, right? I mean, so it seems like
no, we're stating the true revenue amount. You can see how we're paying for it through that decline in the blue bar, because the decline in the blue bar is representing that draw from savings.
So these
the blue bars
are the balances. These are the balances left.
Yeah.
So it's implied
exactly.
where that money goes, the difference. Well, okay. All right. I'll go on mute now.
Okay. Thank you, Cheryl. Neil, can we go to slide 3? There's a request for just a more explanation about the PFD payment scenario.
So slide 3 on the PFD payment scenario?
They referenced slide 3 in the question. I apologize. I don't have the exact slide if that's the correct one, but maybe just speak through what the PFD payment scenarios are for the current year. It could be the next slide, slide 4.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, slide 4. So this less projected PFD payments. So what's being reflected there is the amount of the POMV ERA draw that went to dividend. So that kind of that bottom line number here, the total UGF available for government, is reflecting traditional revenue and POMV revenue after backing out the amount for the permanent fund dividend payment. So it's kind of showing revenue available for government use is the concept.
All right. So we have a question with regard to the FY23 budget that's shown in the 10-year budget plan. So in the 22 budget, it shows that you're using the full POMV for government operations, but in the 23 budget, you're using 50%. Can you speak to where the other 1.3 or so billion in revenue is coming from? What taxes or other revenue sources are you modeling for those revenues?
Yeah, so right now there's not a specific proposal to fill that deficit into 23. So that 50% of POMV, that's reflecting the proposal to move the dividend formula to adjust the dividend formula and move to a 50-50 POMV split. The remaining deficit really is highlighting that, that change and, the changes proposed there don't solve all the problems, that there's still additional work to be done there. We don't have a specific proposal on how to fill that deficit and what types of revenue that might be. But that's this is really highlighting that discussion needs to be had, and that we need to start thinking about that and start thinking about how we actually can fill that gap and start having those discussions.
Okay, thanks. A question with regard to the PERS cost share reduction, or that you mentioned earlier. The question is, why not pursue that for the DGF? Why not also charge for the DGF for employees it pays for?
So that actually, yeah, I was going to say, I think maybe I just didn't explain it well. I think the focus, when I'm explaining it, focuses on getting those funds from the federal government, but it also will impact those DGF sources. So other DGF funds or program receipts coming in, the various sort of fee paying areas, those all will also have to pay in for that total cost. So when we move it into the agency, when we move this cost into the agency budget, it will get allocated the same way that we currently allocate payroll. So when you look, if you read all the in the weeds budget reports, you can see breakdowns by PCN of percent that pays into each different bucket of funds. And so you can see that information. That'll give you an idea of how this will impact. Right now, the impact of that legislation isn't in our budget reports. Since it does require legislation, it'll be coming in through a fiscal note. And when that fiscal note gets released, when the bill actually is released, introduced, that fiscal note will show that breakdown in fund sources and how they, how much additional cost will go to each of those. So you'll be able to see, here's the additional UGF cost and payroll, which will be less than that 100 million roughly that we're paying off in state assistance, and federal BGF, UGF, so on.
Okay. So a couple of questions with regard to the state workforce. One which was somewhat in the news today, that there's consideration being given to long-term work from home arrangements. Are you aware of what those impacts might be, and for making those kinds of things more permanent for state employees? What kinds of cost savings might the state see from something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one of the things we did in putting this budget together and in talking to the departments was asking them, are there places they know of now that, a couple of months into the sort of telework experiment, if you will, are there areas that they know now that they can show savings? Because the one thing that we want to avoid in the budget world is putting in speculative savings, because if we say, oh, everybody's going to telework, and we put in a bunch of savings related to that, and then a lot of those people post-pandemic come back to the office and can't achieve those savings, that's much worse than saying, let's only put in what we know is true, and if less people come back to work, we can implement some of those savings later. So that's why you don't see a whole lot of savings in the budget related to telework, especially considering the time period when we developed the budget. We only were, a couple of months into people teleworking when we started really putting together the groundwork to build into this. Looking into the future, I can definitely see a world where there's a much different relationship of in-office and out-of-office work. How that really manifests itself once we've kind of gotten through the pandemic is, I guess, kind of anybody's guess. I know just anecdotally, talking with program managers, talking with the admin services directors in the state, talking with commissioners, there's a pretty wide variability in the effectiveness of telework. Some jobs it works great, some jobs it doesn't. But I do think that probably come a year from now, we'll probably see a lot more impact into the state budget of that additional knowledge that we'll gain over the next year of how we can actually implement this for some savings, or the areas where it just doesn't work.
Well, related to that, to some degree, there's a reference to your slide showing the $2.2 billion loss in labor income in early 2020. And the question specifically, I guess, is, do you know how much of that might be from government employment? So state and local government employment, let's say.
That's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head. I know that primarily the job losses were hospitality industry, but I don't know the exact breakdown of that $2.2 billion. And I don't necessarily know at the municipal level, those types of government employees, what the impact was there. But that is a good question that would be interesting to do some further research into.
And I guess, when you guys develop budgets, you typically have a range of scenarios in mind. Are there any things in those scenarios where it envisions either a reduction in state workforce or reduction in work weeks or other savings measures coming from the state labor force?
No, really, we've looked at, in terms of the changes in the state workforce that we were putting forward and that we're wanting to pursue, really are just related to those places where we could find efficiencies like that health and social services item, or areas where maybe there's more one-off type efficiencies and savings, but really looking to avoid any kind of large layoff scenario or anything of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Neil, your audience has two preoccupations this morning. One is the permanent fund dividend and the other one is future taxes. And so with regard to specifically the March 2021 PFD payment that's proposed, can you speak to how that impacts the deficit for the current fiscal year, by how much, and what's the resolution for that in the current fiscal year?
Yeah, so the proposal for that payment is to make the payment from the earnings reserve. So while it doesn't necessarily impact our deficit in the sense of our draw on the CBR, it is a draw over and above the percent of market value from the earnings reserve. And that's not a thing that's being taken lightly to propose, but it really goes to this slide that we're looking at here. And Alaska has that mechanism that can get money out into directly to people. We have that mechanism. We have the ability to do that, and that is where that consideration is coming from. It's both that completion of that statutory obligation, but also the idea of that direct financial relief to people. So that $1.2 billion draw from the earnings reserve will have an impact in the future. The percent of market value draw over time does go down, but it's looking at that immediate need of the situation that we're in right now, is that kind of balance between that long-term fiscal impact versus just the current crisis that we're under.
Right. So you've spoken about the need for structural changes with regard to the statutory requirements for the dividend itself and the POMV draw. So again, I think the audience is very focused and preoccupied with looking at the future and realizing that even if we have a solution for this fiscal year, we're still going to be looking at another $1.3 billion deficit into the future based on those FY23 projections. What is the proposal into the future to balance the budget? Obviously, continuing to draw from the earnings reserve in excess of the POMV presents problems in the future.
Yeah, and so I think that's the biggest importance in the constitutional amendment to constitutionalize the POMV, is that will stop and prevent overdraws into the future. And that's a key important piece of this plan, because as the question is kind of alluding to, that's not necessarily a long-term idea that should be followed. That is not the next pot of money to go to. It really needs to be held there into the future, because percent of market value draw. And when you look at that chart at the beginning, with the revenue gap, you can see the traditional revenues are very low. We're really relying on that stability of the percent of market value draw. We're relying on that stability into the future. And so, making sure that there's no possibility in the future that more than a sustainable amount can be taken out, no more than that 5% amount, that's a key, structural change that needs to occur. The other piece, fixing that, the dividend formula, for those who kind of have looked at it, there's just some, functional things that need to be fixed, but also we need to address really what that formula pays out and get it to something that can be done and is more reliable into the future. And so that 50-50 draw, setting that up and changing that statute is important, because that's one of the biggest structural things that we've been facing over time, or over the last few years. Going into the future, we don't have a specific revenue proposal, but we do know there is that deficit continuing on. That the proposal here, while we have a minimal draw from the CBR in 22, it doesn't fix all the problems going forward. So that is something that needs to be addressed, but we need to kind of answer some of the bigger questions that we've been facing first, and answer that dividend question is really the biggest one there.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of the CBR again, we've heard it characterized that over the last several years, I've heard the state needs a minimum of 500 million just for sort of float in the till. And you spoke today about needing about $1 billion in CBR for state operations. What did the state do for cash management purposes before the CBR was created?
That's a very good question. So the CBR has been used for cash management just in the last few years, as we've had, we haven't had, excess money in the general fund. In prior years, there was, use of the general fund or use of other types of inter-fund borrowing. My historical knowledge on cash management in the state doesn't go back that many years before CBR, but there's a lot of other tools that are out there that you can utilize for cash management that other states utilize. There's short-term borrowing. We do have, the concept of revenue anticipation notes, things like that. A lot of those, though, come with a much greater cost than using the CBR, because if you have to go out and you have to, sell debt in order to fund your cash management through revenue anticipation notes or for short-term borrowing, there is an interest rate cost on those things. So having the CBR and having some money sitting there in cash that we can access does help us prevent having to incur some of those other costs. Mm-hmm. That being said, if the CBR were to go away entirely, there are other options and other things that other states utilize in order to achieve the same purpose.
Okay, thanks. The governor has used his budget before as a basis for having conversations with Alaskans about various budget topics. And with regard to the constitutional amendments for the permanent fund and POMV, what's the approach this time in terms of having more conversations with Alaskans? We in Commonwealth North, we really believe in citizen engagement, and we've been engaged in a budget choices exercise where we talked about that earlier, found some, interesting conversation starters in the findings there about people's approaches and thoughts about many of these topics. But what's the governor's approach going to be to have those conversations?
So one of the biggest pieces that's sort of inherent in these proposals is is effectively a special election. So the GEO bond proposal, that $350 million package, that requires a vote of the people to be enacted. We'd like to see that passed through the legislature quickly so that we can hold a special election to actually have folks vote on that, because that will allow us to get that money out quickly. That piece ideally would come along with the advisory vote that is part of the permanent fund dividend statute change. So that is sort of that core public engagement, you know, in the way that, you know, people coming in directly voting on something is kind of the biggest piece of public engagement there. Kind of the most direct way to get the public's, you know, buy-in and opinion on an item. So that's sort of inherent in some of these proposals. And the constitutional amendments, obviously, those all will have to go to vote of the people as well at the next statewide general election. So, you know, kind of through both of those things, that sort of forces a lot of public engagement and sort of forces us to interact and make sure that we are truly enacting the will of the people, basically, is the concept there.
Okay. All right. Well, Neil, I don't see any other questions coming through in chat, so I'm going to turn back to Cheryl and ask her for any closing questions or comments. Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you, Neil, very much for spending the time with us. And it's great to be able to ask these questions and get your insights. To the group, thank you for joining us this morning. If you're interested in the preliminary first round of responses to our budget choices website, they will be posted on Commonwealth North's website, hopefully today, under the Fiscal Policy Study Group. So you're welcome to check those out. And we're going to continue to solicit input. So if you haven't responded, or your family, friends, or neighbors haven't responded, encourage them to do so, because it really is quite interesting to see what Alaskans say when given the opportunity to not only weigh on one choice spending or one choice revenue, but where you have the overall challenge, just like the governor, of bridging a 1.3 billion plus deficit. So Alaskans can be very thoughtful when they're provided information, and be very helpful in reaching some recommendations. So with that, I want to thank you all this morning for joining us. We'll see you on January 8th for our revenue briefing. And in the meantime, have a great holiday and stay safe. So Happy New Year.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Cheryl. We will be posting Neil's slide deck